Types of credit: hire purchase and installment buying.
Have you ever heard of the term hire purchase?
Actually, yes. I know that it is a form of buying goods in which the buyer acquires goods and then pays for them in installments.
That is correct. Where did you learn that?
In mathematics, we calculate the hire purchase price of a product. That's how I learned about it.
I see. The buyer gets to enjoy using the product without having to pay for it first.
However, there is a deposit to be paid before acquiring the goods.
Correct again. The remaining amount of money is then paid in installments within a given period of time.
By the way, why is it called hire purchase?
Because the buyer hires and pays later.
And what is an installment?
Well, an installment is the amount that the buyer pays on regular basis. Take note that the buyer does not acquire full ownership of the goods until all the payment has been made.
So the buyer only acquires the good but not its ownership?
That's right. And because of this, he cannot pass the ownership of the goods to a third party.
Interesting. So what proof of ownership will the buyer have when he has completed the payment?
He will be issued with a certificate of completion.
That's good. And what if the buyer fails to complete the payment?
Then the seller can take back the goods and the buyer is not refunded the money he had paid before.
Oh no, that's mean.
I don't think so. Remember, the buyer was using the product from the moment he acquired it, so both parties have to benefit, however little.
Okay.
Usually, the hire purchase price of an item is higher than the cash price because it is inclusive of interest.
So, why would one choose to buy goods on hire purchase?
A very good question. Now, when we look at hire purchase, we examine it both in the perspective of the buyer and then that of the seller. So there are a number of reasons why a buyer might choose hire purchase.
Such as?
For one, the buyer gets to acquire the goods immediately, even before the final payments are made. How does that sound?
Sounds wonderful. I'd be happy to possess goods I did not have enough money to buy at the moment.
Which brings us to the second point. The buyer does need to have a lot of money to acquire expensive goods such as the fridge. He can just pay the deposit and carry the fridge home and pay for it later.
I also think that the buyer has an easier time paying the installments because the amount of each installment is predetermined and so they can plan for it.
You are right. If I need to pay 3,000 shillings monthly, then I believe that I can fix that into my monthly budget. And so it will reduce the burden.
I know that there is no particular thing that can be 100% good.
That is true. Hire purchase has its own shortcomings even to the buyer. Ownership of the good, for example, is not acquired until final installment is made.
And the buyer cannot do as he pleases with the good until then. This may be inconveniencing.
Yep.
The interest charged on hire purchase is also higher than if someone was to just buy goods using cash.
Indeed.
I also think that it is quite easy to buy something that you do not need simply because you are not paying for it on the spot. Call it impulsive buying.
And the student has become the teacher. Wonderful.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that if the buyer fails to pay the amount in time, then the seller can repossess the good and even sell it. I think that too is a disadvantage to the buyer.
True. You have done a very good job. Now, let us look at this from the perspective of the seller.
Sure.
Now, the fact that the seller retains the ownership of the goods until final payment is done is advantageous to him because he is not at risk of suffering a loss.
Yes, his business is protected.
He also gets to earn a lot of profit since hire purchase price is usually higher than the normal cash price because of the interest amount to be paid on top.
Yes, you already explained that to me.
Secondly, hire purchase services do have a lot of customers. This translates to higher profits for the seller.
Why do they have a lot of customers?
Because customers can possess goods without having to pay for them immediately. And lastly, the owner can resell the goods if the buyer fails to pay for them.
On the other hand, I think the goods can only be sold as second-hand because the buyer has been using them and so wear and tear is bound to happen.
Very correct. Sellers on hire purchase also go to an extra cost to maintain the records of sales as well as collecting debts.
And I am sure there are lots of buyers who default their payments.
Yes, quite a good number, which contributes to the business being quite hard, especially at the initial stage.
I see.
Now that we have looked at open trade, credit, and hire purchase, is it possible to round it up with installment buying?
Why not? Let's do it. What is installment buying?
Well, you can also call it credit purchase or deferred payment. It is a system of credit whereby a buyer pays the initial deposit and the remaining is payable on agreed installments.
How is that any different from hire purchase?
The difference comes in the ownership part.
I know that in hire purchase, the buyer does not own the goods until the full payment has been made.
While in installment buying or deferred payment, the buyer owns the goods immediately the deposit has been paid.
I get the difference. So what happens if the buyer defaults?
Then, the seller has only one option of taking buyer to court because the seller no longer claims ownership of the goods.
Why would any seller agree to such kind of credit? It poses a great risk.
Oh, I like that question. So in most cases, this is done where goods are likely to lose value immediately. Such goods include clothes and foodstuffs.
Oh, I see. Now I am more curious to draw a parallel between hire purchase and installment buying. Can you help me with that?
Of course, that's why we are here. The first parallel is in the ownership, right? Mm-hmm. For hire purchase, ownership does not pass to the buyer until the final installment is paid. Mm-hmm. While for the deferred payments, the buyer owns the goods immediately the initial deposit is made. Mm-hmm. Of course, when you own a product, you are free to do whatever you please with it, including reselling it.
So, that means that a good bought on hire purchase cannot be sold to a third party until the buyer finishes paying the installments, while a good bought on deferred payment can be sold even before completing the payment.
Yes. When goods are bought on hire purchase, there is an option of returning them if the buyer cannot complete payment. When they are bought on deferred payment, there is no option of returning them, and so payment must be made in full.
And if a buyer on hire purchase defaults, the seller can repossess the goods, but the seller cannot repossess goods bought on deferred payment.
Yes, the seller will just have to go to court. And now you know all about types of credit.
Don't you think you are leaving something out?
And what's that?
You said that when goods are bought on credit, sometimes the seller gives the buyer a discount to encourage the seller to pay faster.
Yes, what about it?
Don't you think you should have explained in detail what discounts are?
I don't think so.
Seriously?
Hey, just kidding. Discount is a whole subtopic on its own. If you agree to take tea with me, then we can chat it over.
I'm in. Where is the tea?
In the restaurant around the corner, I suppose. Shall we move over?
Of course, let's go.